Hello and welcome back. We are here now going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think the theory behind the importance of DE&I is widely accepted, but the practice perhaps still struggles to manifest the importance of looking at having a diverse leadership, a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workforce as well, and therefore also an economic and the economy and society more broadly. So before we start looking into what is holding the development of DE&I back, let me introduce you to our panelists. We have Tracy Groves, who is sitting right next to me, who is a partner at DWF, which is a legal and business services provider. And Tracy is also the head of ESG and sustainable business advisory practice at the firm. Right next to her, we have Aduke Onafu-Wokan, who is the director and the founder of Inclusivity, which is a training company looking exactly at DNI. And last but certainly not least, we have Roxana Beiji, who is the global head of diversity and inclusion at the Financial Times. So Roxana, I promise I wasn't going to give you a hard time, but let's see what you tell me about my own employer. So let's start with some numbers. Again, the theory of the importance of diversity and inclusion is very well accepted. I mean, it would be difficult to find someone that actually openly at least tells you it's nonsense, right? But then when we look at the numbers, and I was just actually having a look at the UK numbers before coming here to have a chat. And the gender pay gap, so just looking at one component of DNI, the gender pay gap is still struggling to actually go down to zero. I was looking at a couple of companies based in the UK, financial companies in particular, so HSBC and Barclays, and depending on the entity that actually reports the data, which they do here, we still have between a 30%, 40% pay gap, which is better than what it used to be a few years ago, but still it doesn't feel good, does it? And the first question to all of you, because I know that all of you have a consultancy background, and now you're looking at some sustainability in-house. So what are the practical challenges? What are the real obstacles, the daily obstacles that someone wanting to implement and create a more inclusive company and organization struggles with on a regular basis? So looking at it first from the outside in terms of strategy, you come in and advise the leadership or the person in charge, and actually having the person implementing the strategy. Tracy, I'll go to you first.
Thank you, Sylvia. Well, I actually only advise externally, so I advise clients on their DE&I strategies and their implementation of that. Although when I was at my former employer, professional services firm, I was actually on the Diversity Council and I ran our gender balance network as well. So I do have that in-house viewpoint. But currently, what I'm observing in terms of my work advising clients is the opportunity to really position DE&I as a strategic imperative. Unfortunately, what tends to happen, it becomes an HR issue. It becomes something that is, dare I say it, cuddly, intangible. It's a nice to have. It's a side of the table thing. And we all know that what it should be is absolutely a critical mission imperative in terms of our ability to create a business which is high performing, which unlocks talent and brings real diversity. And I don't mean just demographic diversity in terms of gender or racial orientation. I'm thinking about cognitive diversity, cognitive in terms of thought, experience, and background as well.
Okay, so the struggle is still that this is seen as a nice to have. Is it something that you also are saying? I mean, you started a business based on this, right? And you were telling me you're really busy. So clearly people still ask for your advice. But does it mean it remains a sort of nice to have thing on the side when things are going well and then it gets forgotten in times of trouble?
I think it depends on the industry. Obviously, I do a lot of work in niche diversity and inclusion work, like law enforcement, climate research, cancer research. So there are some areas where diversity and inclusion is not a nice to have. The efficacy of medicine relies on its ability to treat different genealogies. So in those industries, I think that there is a slight slightly different feel to diversity and inclusion. I think employer diversity is probably slower than we want it to be, employer inclusion, employer equity. But I think we must also be careful to see that it's a lot more than just the workplace. It's actually how social goods are shared. It's how government operates. So I think I have seen quite a lot of progress in some of the industries that I've worked within. But also, as I said, with employer diversity, it's a little bit probably a slower pace. But what you said there around gender pay gap, so we kind of think about how do we get to a place where we have gender pay gap? It tends to be because you have overrepresentation of men in senior high-paying roles, and you have underrepresentation of women in those roles, and then you have overrepresentation of women in the more junior, lower-paying roles. And so I think there's something around expectation as well, knowing that it won't turn immediately. I get a bit nervous when I hear people say, oh, it's not working or we're not seeing progress. And we are seeing progress, but it will take a while for some of those roles to turn over. It takes a while. And so I think that realistically, your DE&I initiatives, you want to give it at least 5 years to embed and start to see some of those tangible results. Now, I still worry that maybe 5 years from now, we'll still all be having these conversations, but I think it's important to recognize how gender pay gaps develop and how it takes a long time to start to get those roles turning, and then you get to a place where you see better numbers.
So I have to say, I've been moderating panel discussions about diversity for maybe a little bit longer than 5 years, let's say 10 years, and regularly there is a comment like this, right? So let's see what happens in 5 years. And someone who has been in this area for longer will just sigh and feel a little bit depressed because I've seen it all. Roxana, is this what you also say?
Yeah, I probably did sigh at that point because as someone that's been doing this work in organizations for 12 years now, I know that things take time and we need to have a long-term lens. But I am impatient. I do want to see change. And one of the reasons I joined the FT, for instance, is because I could see, even with the public lens of what was the information that was publicly available to me, was that the organization had made progress on gender pay gap. The organization, even in its content, had shifted from 30 years ago when I was in banking and doing something very different, to include more content on mental health, on women in business. For instance, I've attended the Women at the Top Women in Business event for a number of years. So I could see publicly that things were changing. So that's one of the reasons but I came here, because I could see the appetite was here to make that change and progress and think differently. To your question on even act as a prior consultant, so one of my prior roles was as a management consultant selling diversity, equity and inclusion services to clients. What I would always question, even when clients came to me, was that intent. So if there was a client that wanted to deliver something or bring me in as a consultant and it felt remedial or just reactive to a particular thing without having that long-term view of how will this impact the broader structure, or will this actually be creating systemic change, quite often the partner I worked for and myself would say, no, thank you, this is not for us. We are here for long-term change. So some of our clients were in it for the right reasons, and that's when we engaged. And even as an in-house practitioner, when I'm working for an organization, I probably won't stay if I don't see the commitment to create that long-term systemic change.
Okay. So let me go to a couple of things that you've mentioned. So one is that moment in time where everyone focuses back, or for the first time, around this area, these subjects, and arguably lately was 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. So you did see a growth in not only headlines about the importance of sustainability, but research and companies, even CEOs, business leaders actually publicly commenting about this. Now, maybe it has changed a little bit. Would you say that it has become something else? It's being hijacked, diversity and inclusion, into a different conversation, maybe one that may lead us towards the so-called woke capitalism. And so again, we talk about maybe something that is not as important, but perhaps something with a political agenda. But would you agree with this? And what does it take to actually make it into simply an important business strategy, like anything else that goes into business strategies? Tracy.
Let me start. Well, absolutely number one on my list is ownership. This is actually about taking ownership and walking the talk at the top. It has to start from the top, and not just the C-suite, but the layers both beneath the C-suite, and so it's top down and bottom up in terms of engagement and accountability. So often we see DE&I being seen to be the boundaries within just the HR or the D&I manager or director, and it has to be every leader, every person, no matter what level of leadership that you're at, whether you're a team leader on the shop floor, within the factory, within the division or the function. So very much wanting to see this ownership and this accountability, and then the governance structure around it to hold people accountable. And what I mean by that is that the policies and the procedures then reinforce that. It's behavior that forces change, not the policies. I'm always saying this mantra around, you can have the best policies and procedures in the world, but unless they are lived and breathed through the role models, and then when they are violated or they are breached, then there are repercussions of that, they become meaningless. So it has to be seen to be owned and seen to be taken seriously. And it's not one rule for one individual and one rule for the rest. We can't have high performers, for example, getting away with not being able to demonstrate these inclusive values and behaviors because of they're a high performer. No, this is about everybody from a collective perspective taking ownership from it.
And how do you do that?
Yeah. Well, linking it through to remuneration and pay and incentives is one way of doing it. So making sure that there's metrics and measures to do that. But then the repercussions and the discipline that go around it, I think, are really important. So it's not just words. It is action orientated, but actually what I'm seeing more and more, and it's linked to where we're seeing the wider sustainability agenda going as well, more and more of those executive leaders and being cascaded down, having targets and goals. I use the word targets advisedly, by the way, but having goals in terms of being able to demonstrate their commitment and the change that they are owning and driving themselves.
There is a risk, isn't there, that once the measure becomes a target, then it's easy to game.
Yeah.
And so again, you link that kind of targets to remuneration, perhaps, and then kind of do a couple of moves around, and you hit it, and there you go, without actually changing anything. I mean, are you also seeing remuneration being linked to these targets actually making a difference, or what else is needed?
Well, I am seeing definitely KPIs being linked to some of these targets, but I'll kind of go back to the point I made earlier on about the need for time. And I think that I appreciate what you've mentioned around, that we know that in the past 3-4 years, there's been a revival of diversity and inclusion, like not what we've seen previously. So I think there is definitely recognizing that is progress, and seeing where that takes us is going to be a different wave of diversity and inclusion work from now on, undoubtedly. But what I would say is there has to be a level of clarity between diversity, inclusion, and equity. And then when we say things are not moving, being really clear about what's not moving, because that's when we start to target that point of the leaky pipeline. So a lot of organizations will say, well, we'll still have a bit of a diversity problem, or is it an inclusion problem? Is it an equity problem? So for me, I think what I have seen work really well in the past couple of months has been being able to clarify what exactly has been achieved and what's left, because I am starting to sense that sometimes things are not going forward is now sort of being used as a spanner thrown into the works a little bit to deter, derail, and discourage. So I think that progress is happening, but we just need to be really clear on what are the things that we're not eating. Is it the progression? Is it opportunity? Is it experience? Is it outcomes? What is not working, so that we can then target our resources, our time, our energy, not just reworking what's already working, but actually fixing those really problematic areas. And so, that's where my energy is lately. It's just
so give us some examples. So gender pay gap, that's relatively easy, I would say, to report. What other data points should be reported, and maybe companies would struggle to?
I mean, ethnicity pay gap, for example, is very complex, very complicated. I think only Lloyd's has really at that level done it visibly. So I think things like that will tell a different story. Well, great. So I think that will tell a different story, because we know that even within the gender pay gap, there are gaps as well for different intersectional identities. So I think it's doing that kind of deeper level of analysis of when we say gender, even the 10% who make it to the top levels, who are they and what's their further demographic? Because we may be masking one inequity with another. So I think it's that kind of deeper level of analysis and intersectionality that will probably start to move those stubborn gaps. Because if you look at the demographic of women entering the workplace, it's very diverse. If only a select demographic of that demographic makes it to the top, obviously you always have gender pay gaps. So I think it's those kind of complex intersectional analysis to say, what is left to do, rather than, oh, because I'm getting that a lot. Oh, it's not working. And so HR budgets have been slashed. EDI leads have been fired because it's not working. Wait a minute. It is working, but what is left to do?
Right.
What is
Okay.
left to do,
So to do that, to start reporting and gathering that information in a really meaningful way, you need, again, someone at the top or in charge of that work to have some power.
Yeah. Exactly.
And we were chatting earlier about the turnaround of professionals in covering DE&I. So is that an issue? Are you seeing the status, the authority of these professionals within organizations growing, or do we go back to, oh, okay, that's just one head to get rid of if things don't go as we want it to?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I mean, what I've definitely noticed post the racial reckoning is that there was an increase in the number of diversity, equity, and inclusion roles, and those practitioners were in high demand where there wasn't enough. There weren't enough individuals, there wasn't enough talent to meet demand. So many organizations hired people that potentially weren't practitioners, they were passionate, maybe they were in business resource groups previously. So I think those individuals and those organizations who are fairly new on their diversity and equity and inclusion kind of roadmap, they were probably at that transactional HR compliance phase and then realizing that they needed to take action. But I think they maybe struggle to understand what is it that they want those individuals to do. Did they understand the full role description? Did those individuals have any power or influence in the organization? I think the turnaround in roles potentially has been because of the opportunities presented to people. I think what's happened since is a number of different factors deprioritizing DEI, back to the topic of today. For instance, politics that you mentioned, government, even going back to the gender pay gap, it was delayed during COVID. Why was that deprioritized? If we think about the divisive nature of, around, we have a global audience, we have divisive nature in terms of politics across the globe right now, in terms of the rise of the far right and the politicization of the word woke. So I think there's a number of different factors that are impacting DEI appetite, which then maybe some organizations are feeling influenced, and when they're thinking about scaling costs, when they're thinking about economic crisis, maybe, and they haven't seen the movement or the impact, even if they just started 2 or 3 years ago, they're deprioritizing those roles. But what we know from many organizations within my own network is it is a priority, and where those organizations recognize that it is a priority because it will help to future-proof their organizations, that's where those organizations are thinking about DEI with a lens of the DEI practitioner and team is providing a service to the organization to help see the gaps, to find the opportunities, to understand how it will contribute to growth versus seeing them and holding them responsible. Because I, at the D&I lead at the FT, I'm not making the day-to-day decisions that will impact our headcount, impact representation, impact the various other metrics that I would ask our organization to look at. So ultimately is the accountability piece, again, knowing as an organization where you want to be in terms of a D&I roadmap, and knowing that the accountability ultimately needs to come from the top.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I respond to that,
Of course.
Sylvia? Is that okay? So just interesting, just hearing Roxana speak there. I came to this work through ethics. So my background is a chartered accountant and a corporate ethics advisor. So looking at this through the lens of business integrity, working with organizations in terms of hardwiring what we call doing the right thing into the operating DNA and model of their business. And very much the ethical values of transparency, equity, honesty, trust come to the fore. And so very interestingly, everybody started to say to me and started to have the demand was around, then can you start to look at this through the behavioral lens in terms of inclusion, in terms of how we can respect, be ethical, and actually place dignity at the heart of our workplace, because you can have the most sophisticated compliance function, but without that ethical dimension of doing the right thing, treating everybody as if they deserve to be valued and have that dignity, it falls away. So what's really interesting is I don't call myself a DE&I practitioner, if I dare say it. So here I am on the panel against two very experienced ladies. I don't. I call myself a corporate ethics or integrity advisor, and I look at this through the social sustainability lens. So I will look at topics like psychological safety, like unconscious bias, emotional agility, the inclusive leadership behaviors, which we need to hold leaders to account for in order to achieve our DE&I vision, or signs of success that we have defined for ourselves. So I do wonder whether sometimes reframing it into that business ethics or business integrity language or narrative may help this, because we're simple creatures and we like to put things in boxes, and as soon as we put things in boxes, those boxes can get lids shut on them, and then they open again every now and then because some trigger does it. So let's make it part of business strategy. Let's make it part of our integrity in terms of who we are, and redefine prosperity through that social sustainability lens, which DE&I absolutely is at the core and the heart of.
Okay, so
that's my soapbox rant.
No, that's great. And also, because I know you have a different point of view than Roxana about the turnarounds and why people leave. But maybe we'll go to Duka first, and then we'll talk about turnaround.
I agree. But I just got a bit nervous around, this is a very uncomfortable topic. And it has to be, in order for it to be impactful, because you are getting to the core of power. And at the center of EDI work is shared power, is making power accessible to different groups.
Absolutely.
That notion is very uncomfortable, and so you can rebrand it, you can weave it into something else, but the more you go deeper into what you're trying to do, you will eventually meet with systems of power who hold or want to hold the status quo. And so I'm always the devil's advocate, saying that I coach a lot of senior EDI officers, and they are often what's left when the lights go off, when the good press has gone off and the fancy new EDI strategy lands. Behind closed doors, it's just them, literally, often emotionally exhausted, because day in, day out, they are confronting power. And often that's why people leave. They just realize at some point, actually, this is too difficult, because the only thing that confronts power effectively is power. So it's either you have a really empowered EDI lead, or you don't bother at all. They're just going to leave in 2 years, because the core, and I hope you take this away from this panel, the core of EDI work is not business strategy. Those are the benefits of EDI work. The core of EDI work is shared power, is making sure that there is no few at the top who control the outcomes, the experience, and the access of other people, but actually that is shared. And that's a very difficult thing to do. So when you experience those difficulties, there's a signal, as you said, that you're doing the right thing. So rather than going into that panic mode, keep pushing. Because you're getting into where you need to be getting into.
Is that what you advise your clients?
Exactly. That's it. That point of discomfort is the point where you're going to change law enforcement. That's the point where you're going to get better GPs. That's when you're going to start treating your social carers with more dignity, with more fairness. The point where the conversation takes an uncomfortable turn. If it's too comfortable, if it's too profitable, oh God, we're making more money. Look at it again. That you might actually even be perpetrating more inequity.
Wow, that's such an interesting point. Before we continue, just to remind everyone watching that you can definitely put your questions to the panel. So, and I'm going to read them. Oh, yeah, there are some already coming through. So do continue. But wonderful. Yes. Very interesting. So, but Tracy, because I know that you have a different point of view, and so you already mentioned the reasons why there is such a turnaround, right? In the professionals. So they may be confronted by power, and they may feel exhausted and therefore having to leave. And by the way, where do they go if they leave that company? Do they leave the corporate world entirely?
I think they do. I mean, you probably know this better, but EDI, they tend to rotate a lot and then eventually rotate out. It's called the
out where?
Out into academia, out into consultancy. Out into a place where they can confront power in a more nuanced way. Because for me as a consultant, I don't have to deal with the politics. It doesn't matter if my client doesn't like me; they don't control my KPIs. It's a contractual relationship. But when you are an employee trying to effect cultural, politically leaning, charged change, you have to go back to those same people you've just literally said are and then you're meant to work together as a team. So you do work in a really, but I don't.
gets
Obviously, that's
uncomfortable.
not my reality.
It's
Daily.
It's
Yeah.
a difficult
Yeah.
environment, especially in the last 3 years, right, where there's been crisis after crisis. Post George Floyd, there was a lot of Asian hate. There was 2021 tensions in the Middle East, and that continued with crisis after crisis. So yes, people in DEI roles, I would say, are drained. They're feeling tired, potentially not feeling heard, and where things became uncomfortable, to your point, +1 to the power dynamics, because that's the crux of everything. The reticence and the kind of stepping away even of DEI efforts is the discomfort is maybe getting to people. Maybe they don't fully want to confront, maybe they publicly confronted with, yes, we will give X amount to this community, we will do this, we've made a public statement, we have black squares on Instagram, but when it really came down to the shared power and thinking about how to redistribute power, that's where some organizations sadly aren't walking the walk, as it were.
Tracy?
I'm trying to think what else I can add after, because we've talked about it quite extensively.
Because you were saying that actually as a consultant it's kind of easier to talk to leadership, because
I'm often brought in as an external independent consultant to do exactly that, to challenge and to have the difficult conversation, because I don't have a hidden agenda. I'm not part of the system like the internal head of DE&I will be, and I have no axe to grudge, or there's no repercussions for me apart from doing the right thing for my client, which is to hold the mirror up and to challenge them in terms of what good looks like. And that means accountability, transparency, governance, discipline, all the policies and procedures which are then enacted and enforced. So actually, we come in as independent, we share good practice, we can say this is what's working in this sector, this is what's working here, here's what doesn't work, here's what good looks like. We can advocate what I call progression rather than perfection. So, not about saying this is going to happen overnight or in 3 years or 5 years. We're never going to, we're always going to be working at this. This is a continue, an evolution which is dynamic, it evolves, and there will be things that trigger and happen which will refocus on certain areas.
And do you feel that you're giving some sort of power or authority to the people actually internally?
We're giving credibility and we're giving them the voice, which they should have. They should have this anyway. That's the point. But actually what you're doing is you're reinforcing that. And what you're able to do is to give the evidence and the data that's robust to be able to say, this is what we know makes a difference and will drive change.
And do you think this is the lasting effect that you have? Or is it just temporary as long as you are, showing up in the office?
Goes back to the point whereby when I walk away, who then takes that forward? Does that senior leadership team therefore own it and make it their own? Because actually I will turn down, inevitably, if it's here as a sticking plaster, if it's just there because they want the brand or a particular firm to come in and say they've developed our D&I strategy, then the answer is no, thank you. Because we know it's not going to work.
Okay. So the power structure has to change. A number of stakeholders, to use another term that perhaps is being abused lately, are at it, employers, investors sometimes, I hear. They ask about it, at least that's what they tell me repeatedly. What about regulators? One of the questions is actually about DI laws or regulation, I would say more broadly. And in that, perhaps we can put quotas, we can put maybe potentially mandatory disclosures at some point. In some countries, of course, there are some quotas, but only at board level, which again is kind of relatively easy to comply with. What's the role of regulation in all of this, Roxana?
I think for me, data and an evidence-led approach is critical. So where there is regulation or there is an opportunity to drive action based on regulation, I think it's helpful. So in the last year, like in the US, we've seen the ruling against affirmative action in higher education. We know for a fact in the DEI community, we've had discussions that that ruling, although it's in the US, will have global ramifications on positive action. So even in the UK, where we have positive action versus positive discrimination, which is illegal, what's happened there will impact how we operate here as a DEI community. There will be an additional spotlight. So I think anything that happens in terms of regulation, I think it's important to have regulation. It's important to have targets and metrics individually as organizations, even if the regulation doesn't have it. So where there isn't regulation, I do believe an evidence-based approach to tracking metrics that matter to an organization's DEI approach across the employee life cycle, not just representation data, but across the whole of the cycle, who you're attracting, where you're attracting talent from, who's actually joining, who's progressing, what's the lived experience of people. If you're in a professional services firm, who's getting access to the juicy clients and the juicy projects? Is there a gap? I know in my old firm, there was a gap. You know, so if you're a woman or from a different racial background, you're more likely to be sat on the bench.
Those occasions were close to you. Those opportunities were not available.
Yeah, exactly. So I think tracking metrics, even when regulation doesn't say you need to, is important to drive this work and drive it with that strategic lens.
But then who should push it? Because if things are not changing, should the regulators force the hand? Is that going to be useful? For example, thinking about mandatory disclosures and to the granular level that you're talking about. Would you want to see that?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I would.
What about you, Aduka and Tracy?
Yeah, again, I would like to, as long as we are clear that that's mostly diversity, but equity and inclusion is where we really want to get to. Absolutely. And who should push it? I think, you know, stakeholders, although that word is an abused word, but I think customers, everyone can choose to, you know, we can all, we're market movers. We can, with our choices, do things differently. So I think it's that kind of being really, and I see this a lot in environmental sustainability, people making choices based on their values influences the business as well, because obviously every business wants to make money. But as long as you keep patronizing organizations that have all these shoddy labor laws, who, you know, use child labor or have glaring gender and ethnicity pay gaps, I don't think it's just the regulators, the government. I think it's everyone. We have to see this as a human problem. And when we're making choices in terms of where we spend our money, just go to companies or organizations that are a bit more ethical. I think that would be an incoming influence as well. And people will, the market will respond to that. So I think too many organizations with EDI issues, they're incredibly profitable and people know, and they just go, well, it doesn't matter, and we're still going to patronize, and I struggle with that a little bit. So I think maybe moving the shared responsibility on all of us as a human race to say, is this the right place to be, you know, aligning with?
So talking as we are now,
exactly,
talking about these issues, perhaps is one of the things we can all do openly. Tracy?
I have mixed views on this, and I say this as an advisor to one of the UK accounting and auditing regulator. I'm the advisor on corporate governance and culture. And I say with mixed reservations because the danger of regulation, it becomes a compliance exercise and it becomes an opportunity to tick this box. And it's an exercise, therefore, which doesn't demonstrate anything at all in terms of what it's like to work in the organisation. So there is a good side of regulation where it forces people to have to be able to get that data, because I do think evidence-based approach is absolutely the right way to go. But so what? What's that data telling you? What's that data not telling you? That's what I'm always asking. What does that mean, therefore, in terms of the sense of belonging? What does that mean in terms of the sense of fear or futility about speaking up or creating a climate of voice? How can we go beyond that mandatory disclosure to really understand, actually, is this a place where people feel they can use their voice and they can speak up and be themselves? So it's a double-edged sword, two prongs, if I can say that. But actually, ultimately, I do remember many years ago, there was a young female professional at my firm, and she was on a panel talking about this, and she was asked about quotas. And I was very anti-quotas at the time. And she was asked, you know, what did she feel about it? And she turned around and she said, do you know what? If I can fulfill my true potential, then I'm for it. And that really turned my mind around, because I thought, actually, if that means that at least there's a chance that individuals have the opportunity and the platform to fulfill and develop to their full growth, then actually that's better than nothing.
So perhaps we should look at forcing the hands of companies
but they can be so divisive if they're not used cleverly. You've got to be intelligent. You've got to be vigilant to how they can be abused, if I can use that word.
Yes, of course.
I think it goes to the so what. So if the organisation hasn't been clear about why they care about this, why they want to address underrepresentation in their organization, why is this a priority for them? If they just say, you know, some words but don't actually mean it, feel it, or able to articulate to their own people, let alone to shareholders and public. I think that's the critical piece. They need to be clear on their why.
Okay. So we still have a few minutes, and I would like to try to answer at least two more questions. So one is around AI, artificial intelligence. Where does AI fit into diversity, equity, and inclusion? How can it help? Because at the moment, my gut reaction would be actually risky. It may perpetuate the status quo.
Yeah, it will. Yeah, I think that for me, I think that there is a real risk that AI entrenches elitism and takes this idea of who's a knowledgeable person or who's a knowledgeable contributor in a team to a new level, where we're already working in systems where people who are socioeconomically deprived, who didn't go to university, struggle with work. I feel like once we start to use generative AI in the workplace, could that further reduce employability and lead to poverty? So that I do worry about that a little bit in terms of what does this now mean for people who have no education at all, who are already struggling to get work, and now you've got this super technology that can do work to an incredibly high standard. All of a sudden, who's an illiterate takes a new meaning. So I do worry a little bit about that.
I think for me, when it comes to AI, I probably have two different streams of opinion. One is very much in the caution, and when it comes to even AI and the HR world and the employee life cycle, caution in terms of historical data sets. If we're using historical data sets, there's going to be embedded bias in there. If we're building anything new in organizations which has an AI lens, how do we build it with a view of asking the right questions to mitigate algorithmic inequity, so we're not embedding bias as we're starting to build new products. But I can also see huge opportunity when it comes to AI and diversity, equity, and inclusion. I can definitely see the ability of AI to mitigate against recruiter bias, for instance. So if recruiters have historically, not included people because of their names or backgrounds or universities, we could maybe mitigate some bias there. We could maybe look at predictive data historically and understand where, through some of that data historically, we can predict where bias may have been. So there are definitely, just even internally, I was talking to someone in the coffee queue about potentially developing an AI tool to deliver inclusion nudges to people at the times when it matters, when they're making decisions about pay equity. So I can see huge opportunity to drive my work, to drive DEI work, but also caution at the same time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's the neurodiversity opportunity for the use of AI is huge. And I often think about this when I think about how we're now much more open in terms of embracing neurodiversity and trying to understand how we can unlock the talent and the positive force for good that neurodiverse skills and talent can bring. And I do think the use of technology, including AI, is going to be a really fantastic opportunity and platform for that sector. What I do worry is about the social mobility angle, but I also worry. I remember doing a project for the City of London many years ago now, and there were some incredible stats about the lack of technology literacy within the City of London, which maybe naively I assumed would be of higher levels than some of the more other areas outside of London in the UK. So it does make me believe that are we actually putting in more barriers in place and making it even more challenging? Are you okay? Do you need some water?
I am not. Very complex subject that is making me cough as well.
It's very complex, I agree.
But it seems to be settled, to be settling now.
Good.
So just literally 5 minutes left.
Yep.
Let's answer one other question, which is, and it's actually a nice way to wrap up our discussion. If you were to give advice to an employee of a company and they really would like their company to become more equitable, more inclusive, more diverse, what would be the one advice you could give them? I'll start with you.
So
Good
hard.
luck. Good luck.
I know it's so hard.
You're going to talk to me as an employee of the financial sector.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I think whatever it is you're doing, ask the flip side question. So instead of asking, why are we focusing on increasing representation of women or people from different racial backgrounds, ask yourself why we have an overrepresentation of men. Ask yourself, what if you're building something new, whose voice am I not centering? whose voice is missing in this conversation? Whose voice do I center? Who am I mentoring? Who am I sponsoring? So I think the one thing would be curious questions.
Okay, so asking different, diverse questions.
Yeah, curious questions.
Aduka.
I think it would be to, from time to time, do an inequity forecast. So think about the future and the areas where inequity could still occur. So we know the cost of living crisis, for example, some of the conflicts happening around the world. What would that look like in 5 years for the people that work within your organization, or the people that you would like to see work within your organization? Because I think it's in forecasting inequity that we then move from tackling inequity to stopping inequity. So I would say come out of the sand a little bit and look ahead and go, where could things go wrong in the next 5 years, 10 years, or however much you want to do.
Okay.
So please keep
not
that
getting,
inequity.
Not getting stuck in the day-to-day, but also looking
just
ahead
think of the
and
future.
trying to work
exactly, so that we're not constantly needing EDI consultants.
Thank you, Duka.
I like that one as well. I like both of those. I would say go and speak to people you don't normally speak to. Expand your network. We are creatures of comfort. We love habits. We like to be with people who look like us, sound like us, dress like us, eat the same food as us, listen to the same music. Force yourself. What's the worst thing that could possibly happen? So go and sit in a different team. And I've been doing this with quite a few clients recently, and they have loved it. They've said, you know what, for that day, that morning, I've gone and sat with a different team, and I've learned so much about what they do, how they do it, who they are, what their names are, where they come from. And if much as possible, if we can practically just try and break down these artificial barriers which we put in place through our humanity, which is to keep safe and to do what we've always done, I think we can actually make a lot of difference.
And make our daily life at work perhaps more interesting.
Absolutely, and far more interesting. Absolutely right.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you again so much to the three of you. It's been such a fascinating discussion. Thank you to everyone who's listened and to send us your interesting questions. And of course, I'm sure there were many more going to come if we had the chance to talk for far longer. And we would have wanted to have a much longer chat. So do get in touch with all of us. I'm sure you'll be happy to hear from our listeners. Thank you again so much to Roxana, Duka, and Tracy for sharing your thoughts and for helping us tackle this really important.
Very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.